I'm trying to think. Not only so we are the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice. And not only are we woman-led, we are a woman-only center. Doesn't mean that you're not welcome, but there are other two colleagues. Just raise your hands over there. And that's us. So if you want to applaud, now would be the moment to start. Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I am Lee-Shae, and I work in the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice as an associate professor and a senior researcher. And it's such an honor for me to, let me just get my mic here. So it's such an honor and privilege to be here today amongst old friends and new friends. And we'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to our friends here at Payap University for hosting us on your really beautiful campus. And also to our friends at the ARC for creating the space for this roundtable for 15 years. And it's my honor today to begin this discussion on media, religion, and public scholarship for social justice in the context of our home institution and our careers as well. So in every society, the stories we tell about ourselves, through our media, through our rituals, performances, our myths and symbols, and our collective identities shape the worlds that we inhabit. Representation, though, is never neutral. It reflects the values, hierarchies, and the hopes of the socio-political conditions and cultures that produce it. When we study media and religion together, we begin to see how belief systems, symbols, and power are circulated in public life. And through the lens of social justice, we ask not only what is being represented, but who benefits from these representations and who remains unseen. Before I go a little bit deeper, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about smiles and rainbows. So South Africa, our home country, is known as it's described as the Rainbow Nation. And that is a term coined by our namesake, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he called South Africans the rainbow people of God. Now, coming from the dark years of apartheid, a brutal system of legislated racial segregation that structured every single aspect of South African life from 1948 up until the early 1990s, the rainbow was the symbol of hope, of reconciliation, and of moral renewal. It placed religion right at the center of our national imagination. The rainbow was not just a political metaphor for diversity, but as a spiritual and a moral covenant. It was a promise that our differences... I need one mic. Okay. It was a promise that our differences could be held together under the grace of a shared humanity. Now, Thailand, too, tells a story of national identity through a very powerful symbol, known as the Land of Smiles. It draws deep on Buddhist values of compassion, restraint, and harmony, a cultural ideal of kindness and civility that, like the South African rainbow, captures both national pride and moral aspiration. But if we aren't careful, these narratives can become reductionist. The rainbow can obscure the persistence of racial, economic, and religious inequality. The smile can mask the tensions beneath social harmony. And this is why critical engagement with media, culture, and religion matters, because these symbols shape not only how we see ourselves, but how we understand what justice, belonging, and difference actually means and why it's important. So, a European scholar of religion, Juliana Evolvi, she talks about turns in the study of religion and digital media in particular. And she says that in the fourth wave that we are currently in, it includes online religious groups, and I think this also applies to offline groups, circulating narratives beyond their institutions, right? And that greater academic attention is being given to elements such as gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and politics. And while I'm glad to hear that this is the case, right, that this fourth wave has reached the global north, but I feel like they are finally catching up with the deep south. That's us, right? Because while existing scholarship is focused on Europe and North America, That's only because they perhaps have not been paying as close attention to the work that we have been doing in Africa and Asia. Because evolutionary models of media development do not apply across Asia and Africa. And our scholarship shows that from the very first wave of media and religion research, these issues of intersectionality and of power, have always been at the center of our concerns and our academic inquiries. The thing is that these are not just topics that are interesting to study for the sake of studying or for pursuing knowledge for knowledge's own sake, and it's also not important because finally our colleagues in the global north and beyond, so those who have benefited from proximity to privilege, whether that was geographical privilege or institutional privilege, have finally felt the sting of discrimination and exclusion that a lack of intersectional justice brings. But these issues are important because they speak to fundamental issues about what it means to be human in the world today. Issues of social justice, equality, and ultimately freedom. Now, this is the intellectual and model terrain in which we at the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice are rooted. And when I say rooted, I mean it in two senses, right? We are rooted, that's where we are grounded, but it's also the pathways in which we move. So our work takes a very broad and generative understanding to religion and media as deeply intertwined fields of both scholarship and public life. And our research and our teaching spans 5 intersecting areas. That is religion, gender and sexuality, religion, ecology and economy, religion and media, religion, race and politics, religion, education and epistemology. But what unites us and these areas of research, so what unites us as researchers, as colleagues and as comrades, is a shared commitment to advancing social justice in all of its forms. We hold 2 mottos close: advancing knowledge and advancing justice, and then critical scholarship and courageous action. And these are there to remind us that knowledge must not only interpret the world, it must also participate in its transformation. Now, our recently signed MOU with the Asian Research Center for Religion and Social Communication reflects our commitment to transnational dialogue as a decolonial and feminist practice. You see, we're helping the ARC in their endeavors for gender equality and equity. Very charitable, don't you think? This partnership is not just about scholarly exchange. It is about unsettling the old hierarchies that have long shaped the production and circulation of knowledge. It is about building intellectual relationships that are horizontal rather than extractive, dialogical, and not one-directional. So through this collaboration, we want to explore how religion and media intersect vastly across vastly different contexts, Africa and Asia. So South Africa as the rainbow nation in particular, but also Africa more broadly, and then Thailand as the land of smiles, but also Asia more generally. And we want to think about how in each of these contexts, media representations of religion, morality, and belonging are shaped by histories of colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. For us, transnational dialogue must mean more than comparison. It must be about co-creation. It means listening across contexts marked by different struggles, yet linked by shared commitments to justice and dignity. It means recognizing that knowledge has for too long flowed, and I'm saying flowed very tongue-in-cheek, sometimes very forcefully flowed, from the global north, the west, to the south. But now, deliberately and intentionally, at this moment in this time, we can do this from south to south, from Cape Town to Chiangmai, from Lagos to Manila, in ways that affirm our collective intellectual sovereignty. So this collaboration with the ARC is a decolonial feminist act. It insists that scholarship must not only interpret difference, but engage it with humility, curiosity, care. But if you know us in the Desmond Tutu Center, you'll also know that we try to do this with humor and with joy. We want to invite you, and it invites all of us, to see our context through distinct, connected by very similar questions. And these questions are: how does media shape model imagination? How do religion and representation sustain or challenge inequality? And how might we as scholars and practitioners contribute to more just and inclusive futures? Now, our students are doing this work For instance, Sakina Dramat, who is a PhD student in our center, she looks at how Muslim digital creatives express their faith and identities on Instagram and TikTok. Her study, entitled Digital Content Creatives, Expressions of Religious Identity, Beliefs and Practices, uses a multimodal critical discourse analysis to look at how young South African Muslims are reshaping social media into digital spaces for community belonging and spiritual expression. Another student, Corné Hendricks, very big fan of Professor Heidi Campbell, he's looking at social media and the mediation of religious authority, identity, and community through one particular case study of a Pentecostal charismatic church. Beyond South Africa, we have colleagues in Nigeria who are broadening the conversation with research on the Anglican cable network, exploring how Anglican media is responding to political realities and contributing to civic literacy. These projects remind us that the digital world, the media world, is not separate from religion. It is one of the newest and its most dynamic frontiers. In my own work, a project entitled Media, Religion and the Rainbow Nation, Religious Diversity, Difference and Deviance in South Africa, I'm exploring how religious and media landscape are still haunted by the legacies of colonialism, of apartheid, missionary Christianity, and nationalist broadcasting. Through analyses of film, of streaming television and documentary, I trace how systems of legitimacy, exclusion, and visibility are reproduced, how old logics resurface in new media formats, shaping the socio-political life of religion in our democracy. Now, this work, together with that of our colleague students, are offerings that challenge the false divide between scholarship and lived experience. As a South African woman and as a first-generation academic, I cannot separate the stories I study from the world that I inhabit. The characters, so in my work, I do a lot of work on popular culture, so I work with television series, movies, those kinds of things. So I can't separate myself from the characters and the communities represented in these films and series, because they remind me of my family, of my friends, of my students and my neighbors and my colleagues. They also remind me of the beauty and the divisiveness of our shared experience. So this is the mainstay of social justice scholarship. It's not about detached observation, and scholars of religion and media cannot engage in detached observation. The media is not outside of our world, it is inside our world, we are inside it, but it's about accountable engagement. Now, the final point I want to highlight is that media justice, social justice, and religious freedom, or justice for religion, what this means, and I want to think about what this means and how we can all contribute to them, whether we are scholars of religion or not, right? Scholars of religion and media, or biblical scholars, or philosophers, or sociologists. I think these things are so intertwined that we will all be enriched by thinking about it together. So media justice calls us to do more than just consider representation. It demands equitable access to the means of storytelling and to the platforms where meaning is made. It ensures that those who have been silenced or stereotyped are not only visible, but visible on their own terms. It seeks to build media systems that do not simply include diverse voices as tokens, but share authority, accountability, and the right to define the narrative. Now, social justice will extend on this principle, right? It moves beyond the screen, and it invites us to confront and dismantle the structures, whether they are racial, gendered, religious, and economic, but these structures of privilege that privilege some and marginalize others. It reminds us that justice is not an act of charity, but it's an act of transformation. It challenges us to reimagine societies where dignity, equity, and freedom are not distant ideals, but lived realities. Now, I know that I'm running a bit over time. I just want to give us 5 quick examples how we can all contribute to this work. We can consume media more critically, asking about whose perspectives are missing. We can amplify inclusive stories that humanize rather than stereotype. We can use our own platforms responsibly to encourage dialogue and empathy. No flexing. Right? No flexing. We can hold institutions accountable, from media houses to faith communities for how they represent and how they regulate differences. And we can practice reflexivity. We need to recognize how our own positions shape what we see and what we overlook. So as we continue in this conversation, we do so in the spirit of Archbishop Desmond Tutu's vision. And that vision, when I think about it in terms of my work on religion, media, and social justice, it is about seeing knowledge as sacred and religious knowledge as particularly sacred and transcendence. It is about seeing diversity not through a lens of difference, but through a lens of divinity, really, and as an essential part of the core of the human experiences, and to see justice as a moral imperative. So may our work as scholars, citizens, and storytellers continue to advance both knowledge and justice, and may we do so courageously and collectively. That's me. Now I'm going to introduce. So now I'd like to introduce my wonderful colleague. So we don't just in the center, we don't just study religion and media, but we also use media as a platform for public scholarship, creating spaces where research on religion, gender, race, and justice can be made accessible, participatory, and transformative. So Professor Sarojini Nadar, who is the director of the Tutu Center, and she's the Desmond Tutu Saatchi Chair in Religion and Social Justice, is a world-renowned and leading scholar of religion and gender. She's going to reflect on her work as an African feminist scholar of religion, sharing how she has engaged media as both a tool and a technique of public scholarship for social justice. Professor Nadar. Is it on? Yeah, you can hear me. Good morning, everyone. So let me also begin by thanking our gracious hosts and the organizers of this conference. It is a privilege for us to have traveled with 6 people from the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice at the University of the Western Cape. And it is really good to be back on this campus. We were first here in 2022 under the generous invitation of Dr. Lee, and this is now our 3rd visit. Our official story to our university is that we keep returning because of the intellectual hospitality that we receive here. But between us, it's also about the culinary hospitality. We love Thai food. When our Lee, we've got 2 Dr. Lees here, when our Lee told me that she had proposed our names for this panel and asked me to reflect on how I have used media in my own scholarship, I was slightly hesitant about the panel because I'm not, after all, a scholar of media. But as I began tracing my own work in the media across the past 2 decades, I realized that I have been using media, sometimes deliberately and sometimes by accident, as a space of public scholarship. Between 2008 and 2025, I found that I have written over 20 pieces of public scholarship, opinion articles, columns, and collective statements published in South Africa's widely read media outlets and through the Desmond Tutu Center's own platforms. I've also made more than a dozen television and radio appearances, and more recently I've been invited as a guest on podcasts. So it seems, especially with the podcast, that finally my message is meeting the medium or caught up to the medium. Now, I'm not sharing this because I want to suggest that I'm an intellectual celebrity, even though my family believes that I am, but we know families don't count when it comes to that. But because I have come to understand that what I do fits Edward Said's description of the public intellectual, someone who translates complex ideas for public use, who speaks truth to power, and who unsettles the comfort of dominant narratives. So for me, this is what feminist scholarship in religion demands. Not only the analysis of the world, but as feminist theorists insist, the question, so what? What difference does our scholarship make? And today I want to offer 3 reflections on that question. The first reflection begins with my very first meeting with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, shortly after I had been appointed to the Desmond Tutu chair.
Now, he was, as everyone who has ever met him knows, both very gracious and very mischievous. So when I told him about the new chair, he looked delighted, but also slightly bemused. A chair in my name, he chuckled. I can't imagine why anyone would want to do that. Then he turned very serious and asked, so what are you going to do in this chair? And I to be honest, I didn't know at that time, but I explained that one of my first responsibilities was to deliver an inaugural lecture. And he asked me what I planned to speak about. And again, I had to admit that I didn't yet know. And he smiled and he said something that I've never forgotten. He says, when I'm invited to speak somewhere and they don't give me a topic, I ask myself, what is peeving you off? And he used another word which I can't repeat, so let's just say peeving. What is peeving you off most in this moment? What keeps you awake at night? And that's how he said he chooses the topic on which to speak. And that moment gave me permission to take seriously for myself the unease and the anger at injustice that often drove my own scholarship. That exchange with Archbishop Tutu shaped not only my inaugural lecture at that time, but I later realized the way I approach my public writing. Much of my work begins in discomfort. It begins in what troubles me, in what angers me, and therefore what feels morally urgent to me in that moment. So in reflecting on today's panel, I realized that it was the same energy, that impulse to respond to what disturbs my spirit, that inspired me to write my very first opinion piece in 2008. It was published in the Mail and Guardian, which is a South African newspaper with a wide and engaged readership known for its critical journalism. And that first piece was called, When Did the Rock Become Weak? The title drew on a well-known slogan in South Africa, which goes like this, Watinta Bafazi, Watinta Mbokodo, which literally translated means, you strike a woman, you strike a rock. And this was the rallying cry of the 1956 march of 20,000 women from all race groups who opposed apartheid's racialized pass laws. My question in that opinion piece, when did the rock become weak, came from something I saw while driving behind a bus during the annual 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which we observe in South Africa, and I imagine some of you might observe in other parts of the world. On the back of the bus was a large poster that declared the local municipality support for the 16 days of activism. But at the bottom of the poster was the tagline, defending the weak. Now, what concerned me about the slogan was that while the municipality was publicly supporting the 16 Days campaign, it was doing so by drawing on the very trope that promotes and sustains such violence, the belief that women are weak. At the time, I and several of my students had been conducting research in churches and community spaces where we heard repeatedly that men are violent against women, either because they believe that she is weak and must be dominated, or that she is weak and therefore must be disciplined, or that she is weak and must submit to authority. And when she transgresses that, she must be punished. So when I saw the slogan, defending the weak, I recognized how misplaced it was in a campaign meant to challenge gender-based violence. More importantly, I understood that the logic of the slogan was rooted in religious and cultural thinking and socialization that equate femininity with fragility and masculinity with control. So in that opinion piece, I used feminist and cultural analysis that is central to my academic research to show how this language, though benevolent in tone, reproduces the very gender hierarchies that make violence against women imaginable. So it was my first attempt to translate feminist theory into a public argument. And it taught me that the anger that drives feminist scholarship can be a productive moral force, a way of connecting rigorous analysis to the urgent ethical questions of public life. So my second reflection takes me then from 2008 to 2021, again to an opinion piece that I also wrote for the Mail and Guardian newspaper titled A Time for Collective Grief, Reflections on the Phoenix Massacre. This piece was written in the aftermath of a widespread civil unrest during the COVID pandemic. And that followed the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma. It has come to be known as the July riots and the Phoenix Massacre. It was an enormously precarious time for us as South Africans as we witnessed what began as political protest quickly spiraling into looting, violence, and racial tension across many parts of KwaZulu-Natal, where I was born and grew up. In the community of Phoenix, which is the suburb I grew up in, a township actually, not a suburb, which has a large South African Indian population, racialized vigilantism began to take hold. Armed groups of mostly Indian men set up informal roadblocks to protect their neighborhoods from what they perceived as violent mobs. Black African men, many simply walking through or seeking food, were stopped, harassed, beaten, and in some cases killed. Dozens of people lost their lives. As I said, I grew up in KwaZulu-Natal, so I recognized immediately the fault lines that had reopened. The racial tension between Indian and Black communities is not new, especially in poor and working class neighborhoods. It is one of apartheid's enduring legacies, even 30 years post-apartheid. So watching these events unfold in 2021 and hearing stories of Indian residents racially profiling Black people as looters or threats was devastating to me. It felt like history had returned in full force, the ghosts of colonial divide and rule strategies haunting the present. So when I sat down to write that article, I was motivated by that same ethical discomfort that had shaped my earlier feminist work. Anger at how deeply social and economic hierarchies are normalized and how easily violence is rationalized. But this time the focus was on race and class and on how masculinity operates as the language through which these socio-economic anxieties are performed. In the piece, I tried to show what happened in Phoenix was not only racial violence, it was also a performance of wounded masculinity. Many of the men who took up arms were themselves economically precarious, unemployed, and fearful. They turned to the familiar cultural scripts that define masculinity through control and protection. Defending the neighborhood, therefore, became proof of manhood. These actions were shaped by what I would call cultural and religious grammars of masculinity. In both Indian and Black communities, men are often socialized through family, faith, and culture to believe that their value lies in providing, leading, and protecting. So my time is very limited, so I'm going to go to the third. The third part. Okay, sorry, I'll just end with that second part with saying, in writing that op-ed, I extended my earlier concerns with gender into a broader intersectional analysis, showing that the same patriarchal logic that legitimizes violence against women also underpins racial violence. So my third reflection, is my final one, shifts from written journalism to social media activism, another arena where my scholarship has found public life. So in October 2024, I wrote what became known as the Queer Kairos document, a call to justice, transformation, and love in Southern African churches and beyond. This document was drafted in response to a decision by the Anglican Church of Southern Africa's Provincial Synod to reject a proposal to bless same-sex unions and to offer pastoral prayers for couples in civil union. For me and for many others, that decision symbolized how religious institutions continue to reproduce injustice, not only around sexuality, but through the same intersecting structures of gender, race, and class that my work has long interrogated. The same theological logic that once justified racial segregation now underpins the exclusion of LGBTQIA+ people from the full life of the church. But unlike the 1985 Kairos document, which circulated through church networks and activist meetings and probably was sent with pigeons in triplicate, this one spread through social media. Once I drafted the document, Ferial Mali, our administrator at the Desmond Tutu Center, helped me set up a Google form to gather signatures. We shared the link on Facebook, on WhatsApp, and email, reaching out to colleagues, clergy, and activists in South Africa and beyond. Within a single week, we had gathered more than 1,000 signatures from people in over a dozen countries. So by circulating the document online, I learned that public intellectual work today requires an expanded understanding of media. I know I was late to the party. It's no longer only about print or broadcast platforms. It's about how ideas travel through digital networks and how solidarity is also built through clicks and shares. So in conclusion, across these three reflections, one thread runs through them all. Whether I was writing about women and power, race and violence, or sexuality and faith, my goal has been the same: to make the ideas that shape my research and teaching speak to the world beyond the academy. Together, these reflections trace how my work has moved across media, from the printed page to the online platform. But the underlying question remains constant. How do we ensure that what we know and what we teach matters out there in the world? For me, the answer is clear. We write, speak, and act not only to interpret the world, as Lee said in this panel description, but to transform it. And I'm really sorry I went over time. And I would like to now introduce Dr. Thandi Gamedze, who's a senior researcher in the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice, and Thandi works in the area of race, epistemology, and education.
Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. I will try and keep things short because I'm terrified that this panel goes over time when everything today has been so amazingly kept to time, which is something I've rarely experienced. But to get into some of what I'll be speaking about, and as a way of introducing myself a little bit more, I want to briefly situate myself in terms of some of the things that have shaped me around this topic that I'll be speaking about here. So firstly, prior to being at the University of the Western Cape, I worked in a community-based organization called The Warehouse, which worked with churches in response to social justice. So we challenged churches, we supported and equipped churches to develop social justice theologies and praxes in their work. So this work was deeply pedagogical and looked a whole range of ways. So we facilitated workshops. It was very relational. We developed contextual Bible studies to address different issues that people were thinking about. We developed resources to equip people with the tools to do this kind of work, both theological and practical work. And because of this, a lot of my work, in a way, felt like translation work, I think similar to what Sarojini has been reflecting. So translating these ideas of how theology can be liberative into accessible ways that churches can grapple with and engage and use practically. So this looked a whole broad range of ways. So we used, various forms of media, even though that wasn't necessarily how I was exactly thinking about it. But various forms played a role in this. So I started and led the Warehouse podcast. We developed various kinds of materials and resources for churches to engage with. We ran reading groups where people could engage with these ideas dialogically through the means of a text. It also included poetry because I love poetry. I'm a poet. And so that space was very formational in my own thinking about this work. A second important part of this formation has been very much related to the context of South Africa and involves the histories and legacies of the South African anti-apartheid liberation struggle, particularly given my own upbringing in the church and my Christian identity, the church's role in the liberation struggle. So some key aspects of this include Black theology and other South African liberation theologies and traditions. A third important part of my formation has been the work of Paulo Freire, which has been enriched and deepened by bell hooks. In particular, what has been important is the orientation towards conscientization, dialogue, participation, analyzing power, and then developing agency for critical and embodied praxis, which challenges relations of domination and challenges these powers both externally in the world and internally within ourselves. Freire has actually had a significant role in South Africa's liberation struggle. His works were deeply engaged in various movements for liberation, and his books were banned, and that's a way to circulate them more because people want to get hold of them. So he played a very important part in I think, inspiring a lot of these movements, particularly the pedagogical aspects. And then, of course, I am now in the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice, and thinking particularly in that space, in the academic space, about education and epistemology, as well as race and politics. So I want to talk about one example of my experimenting with various media to carry out this kind of pedagogical conscientization work. In my case, particularly within the Christian church in South Africa. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Freedom Theology South Africa, which is a game or activity. I think I'm really taking this from the technological sphere right back into the past in a cardboard box, very tactile. But this is a game which sort of follows a bingo adjacent methodology. And it emerged out of a recognition that although the South African church has a very rich history of resistance against injustice, many of the specifics of what this looked like are largely marginalized within churches today, and many people actually are not aware of these histories. They're not really talked about or taught in those spaces. So noting this, I was very inspired by this quote from Paulo Freire. He says, "No one conscientizes anyone else. The educator and the people together conscientize themselves thanks to the dialectical movement which relates critical reflection on past action to the continuing struggle." So this quote highlights the centrality of history within conversations about and actions towards social justice. As Freire indicates, this attention to history includes understanding and critically reflecting on past struggles. And then I was also inspired by this quote from one of our liberation struggle activists in the church, Alan Busak. And he says, "I use the term unremembering in describing what I saw as the deliberate distortion of our recent history of struggle, how the role of the faith of the people, and in particular the prophetic church in that struggle, was being faded, ignored, or erased. I pointed out that throughout our history of struggle, religious faith as a praxis of solidarity and resistance was central to the oppressed themselves in that struggle, as in fact it had always been." So given the reality of this kind of unremembering of South African church social justice history, I decided to create this game, Freedom Theology South Africa, as a fun and accessible way for people to engage histories of the church in the South African liberation struggle. You can see I'm very much a church history nerd in this way, making it a game and forcing people to play it. Okay, we can play tonight for anyone who's keen. So I wanna try and keep to time, but I just want to say it was inspired by something that two people that I greatly admire actually experimented with in trying to engage groups of young people with African history. So two historians, my friend Connie Benson and my brother Asher Gamedze. So they created this workshop series called Know Your Continent and developed this kind of what they were calling a radical history bingo, where they engaged African history to try and disrupt these colonial narratives of borders as they exist on the African continent, but also within our various spaces of engaging, like the university and the classroom. So this idea dovetailed with a side project that I had kind of been nurturing, where I was kind of collecting these stories of the South African church involvement in the liberation struggle in things that I read and kind of saving them. And so I had this little mini archive of some of these stories and decided at some point to develop that into this game or activity. So in it, there's 16 information cards, and each of them holds a description of a particular aspect of the South African church's historical engagement in the anti-apartheid struggle. There's a bingo board which has 16 blocks, each of which relates to one of the cards, and it has like a little description. And then each person gets one of the cards and one of the boards, and then they have to go around and talk to each other and find out what's on everyone's cards and fill in the answers on their blocks. And so you end up with quite a broad knowledge of some of the church's involvement in the liberation struggle. And then maybe just to end off, I'll read out an example of one so that you have an idea. So the description on the card would be an initiative to address the racism in the Anglican Church in 1967. And then the information card that's attached to that block is titled The Woodstock Theses. And the description is, the Woodstock Theses were a collection of 95 theses which highlighted and challenged racism specifically in the Anglican Church. These emerged out of a Christian Institute organized conference in the Western Cape themed around the church and race relations in South Africa. In a symbolic reenactment of the events precipitating the Reformation on 31 October 1517, an anniversary yesterday, on the night of the 31st of October 1967, a group of Anglicans led by the priest of St. Mary's Church, Woodstock, in Cape Town, where we're from, marched from St. Mary's to St. George's Cathedral, which is the seat of the Anglican Archbishop, and they nailed this document containing the 95 theses to the main door. While the critique was primarily addressed internally to the Anglican Church, it posed a decisive challenge to the South African Church more broadly, forcing it to recognize and reckon with the racism present within its own institutions. So this is a very non-technological version of how I've been trying to use different forms of media to try and do this work of public pedagogy and conscientization. Thank you.
Wow. So we had three presentations that really demonstrates this intersectionality between scholarship and praxis, and in relationship with various forms of media. And so nowadays, when we think of media, we really kind of just think of digital platforms. But then Thandi's presentation really shows us that we can still use some of these traditional methods and also